The rehabilitation of Nashville is complete. The status of the patient was critical at best. However, after years of nurturing and proper care, the patient is alive, well, and doing better. The prognosis is good. And like so many cities across America, the recovery of Nashville's downtown central business district and surrounding area came about as a result of a dedicated group of architects, politicians, business entrepreneurs, civic organizations, and Metro employees who looked into the future and saw a need to preserve the past. In order for Nashville to have preserved and utilized its historic architecture for continued public use, the structure of the buildings had to be safe for human habitation. Moreover, it is the responsibility of the Metro Codes and Building Safety Department to ensure that the rehabilitation of Nashville is safe for all. The rehabilitation of downtown Nashville took many years to achieve. In post-war America, a tremendous change took place over the landscape of the country. After World War II across America, municipalities began to decentralize as the suburbs lured millions of people away from the cities. Migration from urban areas into the suburbs had a tremendous impact on the demographics of the inner city. As the population began to shift from the cities to the suburbs, the steady flow of tax revenue began to disappear as well, and property values became depressed in the inner cities throughout the country. This meant that many cities lacked the funds necessary to perform the public services needed to maintain a safe and healthy environment. In order to stop the further deterioration of America's inner cities at this time, the federal government, in partnership with local governments, began to implement a sweeping new policy called urban renewal. This trend began in the late 1940s and continued until the mid-1970s. It would have a profound impact on American cities and public policy over the next quarter century, and was the source of much controversy.
The purpose of urban renewal was really a very well-intentioned one. Urban renewal, which I think in many ways was neither urban nor renewal, was an attempt to take care of the blight of older cities.
Urban renewal, by and large, came to be known as just here come the bulldozers, because that's what it was doing, getting rid of slums. That went out of vogue probably in the late 60s, early 70s to mid 70s. People got a stigma, the urban renewal got a stigma about here come the bulldozers. So the Housing Authority at the time came up with a new concept of redevelopment districts.
Redevelopment districts were the first tool that Metro government put in place to try to protect some of the historic buildings in downtown. And in particular, you know, the property values are so high in downtown that a number of owners were very skittish about historic zoning. But the redevelopment districts were put into place with some very strong preservation language.
They did more than just bulldoze land. They took underutilized properties and undeveloped property and took that property and put the infrastructure in place and then sold it to private development, or that the Housing Authority actually developed it themselves. And that concept of the Capitol Hill project became Capitol Mall project, which was a redevelopment district, which got rid of more underutilized commercial property, and we have the Capitol Mall Park down there today.
Since the Capitol Hill project began, 7 redevelopment districts have been created over the last 30 years, breathing new life into downtown rehabilitation.
I think the redevelopment districts, those administered by MDHA, have been good for the city in that it brought to the table someone to view an area of downtown or an area of the city and to view it as a neighborhood or as a community, just to ensure that the new development and the new construction taking place within that area was consistent with the space that's already there.
Beginning in the mid-1960s, there was a realization on the local as well as national level that while there are some positive benefits from urban renewal, too much of our nation's architectural heritage was being sacrificed and squandered. One example was an attempt to demolish Penn Station in New York City. This incident gained national exposure.
The tearing down of Penn Station, which was designed to be an iron version of the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, a colossal, magnificent set of spaces that were truly Roman in their quality and monumentality. And I remember very clearly the television and newspaper coverage, because you had some very influential and very affluent people picketing on the sidewalk to stop it from happening when it was announced as a possibility, including someone such as Jackie Kennedy and Philip Johnson, the architect, and other people that were well known and influential at the time. That was a watershed event.
The whole movement developed not necessarily in response to codes as much as to an awakening that we need to start saving our architectural treasures before they're destroyed. For buildings, you know, a building like the Pan Am building that many consider very ugly and out of scale with the city, and people realize that it replaced something that New Yorkers held to heart as a treasure, and so that really got Americans' attention.
In the 1950s and 60s, where entire neighborhoods of urban blocks with nice streets, often with working class families, were torn down, and what replaced them were housing projects, where the streets were taken out into what are now called super blocks, enormous tracts of land with freestanding buildings in them. And I think we now know in retrospect that was a tragic mistake.
The National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 were milestones in the rehabilitation of American cities and the beginning of change in the current policy at that time.
Urban renewal and the Interstate Highway program both began soon after World War II, and those two federal programs, both very well intentioned, had an unintended effect in that they laid waste to neighborhoods and to housing that would have been very desirable to many people. So as a result, the National Historic Preservation Act came into being. That was in 1966, and that really triggered preservation all over the country. It created the National Register of Historic Places, and it called attention to properties that weren't just significant antebellum houses.
We were losing rapidly a precious commodity, and that is our history as represented by our buildings.
This was followed in the 1970s by the Tax Reform Act of 1976 and the 1978 Revenue Act. Together, this legislation created incentives to preserve historic architecture and establish investment tax credits for building rehabilitation. As these developments took place nationally, there were those in the Nashville community who felt the time had come to spread the gospel on the restoration and rehabilitation of Nashville's historic architecture.
In 1975, our office did a survey of historic neighborhoods. At that time, we identified 23 inner city neighborhoods that we saw as high priorities. We now know that there are more than that, but that was our first effort, and it was indeed the first effort of the city to look at neighborhoods and to say these are important.
The rehabilitation of downtown Nashville was particularly challenging because many of these structures were designed and built prior to World War II. The standards for building safety changed greatly following the war, and in order to keep them compliant and safe, rehabilitation was necessary.
The building construction that took place in those days was largely heavy masonry and thick timber construction. Different materials, a different day, different types of equipment was used in order to build them. And when you compare that to the way buildings are built today and the codes that are in place today, there's a great deal of difference between the two basic types of construction prior to World War II, following World War II.
So many buildings built before World War II, for instance, would have one stairwell in them, high-rise buildings with one stairwell. And when the newer codes were adopted after World War II, primarily up through the 1950s and 60s, we were required to have two means of egress, two stairs, and that made a huge difference on how we get in and get out of a building for safety reasons.
The dimensions of hallways and door openings has changed and gotten wider, in part for safety reasons, but also so that people with disabilities, perhaps in a wheelchair, can be completely mobile in a building. So the building is designed for universal use, people of all generations and all conditions of health.
This meant that the newer codes had special regulations not observed in older buildings.
Now, the older buildings do have numerous openings in the floors. And what we've begun to call those are atriums, where you connect more than a couple of floors together with openings. That's what we call an atrium. In the olden times, these spaces help move people and goods and actually help keep the buildings cool by bringing the cool air in at the bottom and exhausting the hot air out at the top. That does the same thing in a fire, so you create this chimney and it'll spread it all through the building. One of the issues that we have to work on very hard is keeping those vertical openings in a building from becoming chimneys, and we do that with glass walls or rated partitions. We're in essence just keeping the air from moving around in the building and spreading the fire.
In terms of building codes, there's not a whole lot of difference between what you're allowed to do in the conventional code and what you're faced with when you're renovating a historical building. There are just a certain number of things that the new codes don't allow for.
From a codes perspective, what were some of the challenges that compliance presented to architects?
Whenever you do a significant renovation of an older building, you are obliged to bring it up to code. And what that means is you've got to potentially introduce a second 2-hour rated fire stair. That means that it will withstand a fire at a certain temperature for 2 hours to provide sort of safe egress out of the building. Oftentimes it means retrofitting in sprinklers. It may mean changing the kind of glass that's in the windows to bring them up to code.
Some exceptions that we've been able to take with the codes are, some of the technical details, say, of monumental stairs or of things like that. For example, the code of 1999 says that the riser and tread has to equal a certain number, and the code of 2000 has changed that. And so a lot of these older buildings have stairs that do not pose a threat to life safety at all, but don't meet the current code.
The older buildings obviously are much more ornate. The craftsmanship in them is incredible. Today's buildings tend to be more focused upon providing safety to the occupants within the building. And in order to achieve both, to protect and preserve the attractive and the ornate, and then adapt it for reuse for use today and to meet today's codes, there's obviously a great deal of latitude has to be employed in order to make these buildings work today.
Handicap access in these older buildings is another issue we have to deal with. Generally, the vertical access to a building is handled by an elevator, and most people are going to put elevators in multi-story buildings just for convenience. The accessibility to the bathrooms, people are probably going to build new bathrooms, so that's covered also. One area that they do have problems is some of the buildings have multiple levels on each floor. And then sometimes that becomes a little tough to ramp it and all that, so that's probably one of the more difficult things to deal with in a building.
Ultimately, one of the greatest challenges an architect faces is how to maintain the original character of the building while bringing it into compliance.
In existing buildings, there are components of the building that are just not building code compliant any longer, as in stairwells, numbers of doors, widths of doors, etc. In many cases, in renovating a building, we'll be able to keep historic features in place that still have a sense of place and have a character to them that we want to maintain, but they're not technically they no longer meet the building code, but they are close enough that we'll be able to keep them and keep the value that they add to the property.
One of the bigger constraints to rehabbing an old building is that with a new building you can design it in terms of width and height and depth to meet any codes that we might have within the confines of your site. But an old building, you got to work around what's there.
It is ironic that older historical buildings, constructed in the 19th century, were so well built that many aspects of their construction are considered acceptable and safe by today's standards.
In terms of timbers, again, heavy timbers, the type of construction that's allowed by codes for a lot of uses. So code is already oriented towards that. It sometimes may not be allowed, given the height of the building or a certain use. So the way of protecting the structure that I discussed earlier in terms of sprinkling, washing the timbers with sprinklers, is a way that gets you that bit of extra distance to replace having to cover them with sheetrock. The solid masonry walls typically give you, a 2-hour fire rating, so they're great to have. If you have a solid masonry wall in a structure, they're great to have in terms of fire separation. I think, again, the key thing there is in terms of how you maintain their integrity.
Masonry buildings, as in 2nd Avenue in downtown Nashville, typically the exterior walls are heavy masonry, 2 or 3 or 4 bricks thick. The structure of the building, the beams that connect the walls are very heavy timbers, very heavy beams made out of wood. What's interesting with a piece of wood that large is it takes a tremendous fire for it actually to burn through. So masonry building with wood beams is fairly safe in that it takes a long time to char the wood and then takes even longer for it actually to burn completely down. So those buildings are relatively safe, surprisingly.
The wood structure is, if not compliant fully with heavy timber provisions of the code, is much heavier timber, full-size lumber than you can purchase today than it's put in, and where a 2x4 today might be 1.5 inches in width, they would be 2 inches. And so they have thicker decks, they have deeper beams, bigger columns, wood beams, wood decks that do much better in a fire situation than does steel.
Technological innovation has contributed greatly to the restoration of older historic buildings in Nashville. It has allowed these structures to maintain their authenticity and character.
I think we've got new products and new methods, new materials available today, but the new methods, a very basic new method is fire sprinkler systems. Other basic technologies and methods is the development of those basic sprinkler systems for specific applications that might be unique. To put a deluge of water in an area where we have a window opening into an atrium, the code wouldn't allow that window opening into that open area, but yet if you can protect that window either with fire-rated glass and or with a deluge sprinkler head, then maybe we can allow it when comparing the building to today's code requirements.
There's been great improvement in wood materials, where they're fabricated or factory manufactured materials that allow much longer spans for wood without having to put columns in like you used to have. In structural strength is much higher than the old wood. So there's been numerous technological changes that have gone into the codes and into construction techniques and methods that come into play all the time.
you go beyond what the code requires, the base code requires when you're developing your alternatives. So very often, especially in smaller buildings that don't require fire alarm systems or smoke detectors, we'll put in interconnected smoke detectors in lieu of something else. So, in a situation where a building that would normally meet the fire code in terms of keeping people protected in the case of an emergency, when you're not able to do that because you want to leave something exposed, having a more integrated alarm system, early notification system, gives people a way to get out of the building quicker than they would in a normal situation, a normal code situation.
The Rehab Committee, which is a part of Metro Codes and Building Safety, is credited with creating an atmosphere of cooperation between the public and private sector. The committee has made it possible for rehabilitation to flourish in Nashville.
As we went through an exercise a few years ago, we compared Nashville's rehab code and our rehab committee process to every known rehab code to be in existence at the time, whether it was the New Jersey Rehab Code or the Philadelphia Code, the North Carolina Code. There was one, the Knoxville Rehab Code. And we laid ours down in a side-by-side comparison in front of some of the business leaders in this community through the downtown partnership. And we evaluated our code side by side with the rest of them. And it was the overwhelming consensus of that committee that our rehab code allowed the greatest degree of flexibility, and our rehab code allowed you to maneuver the process more quickly than any of the others.
By being there, by being flexible, by knowing they can come in and talk to us about anything they want, they can propose any type project they want, that we're not handcuffing them from the start, we're willing to listen to whatever they want to propose, I think has really helped, because I don't think they're afraid to come in and talk to us and just say, oh, no way in the world we're going to be able to do this project. We're not here to kill progress. We're here to try to develop the downtown, keep the older buildings in place, but make them safe.
They work with us really well in trying to achieve our goals and meet the life safety requirements of the code. And the code has a lot of exceptions and a lot of interpretation that they're willing to really be flexible on, assuming that life safety is not, compromised.
The rehabilitation of Nashville took another giant step forward in 1998, when the Metro Council expanded an existing zoning ordinance to accommodate those who wanted to establish residency in the downtown business district.
When we started with our rehabs in '84, on up into the early 90s, mid 90s, almost every project we had was commercial, business, retail type spaces, maybe a residential unit or two, but it was almost all residential or commercial or restaurants or assembly spaces. Starting in 96, 7, whenever, it's almost all residential. It might have accessory retail spaces. It might have a restaurant in the building or something like that, but it's principally condominium units or apartment units that are being done residentially, and that's been a huge change. It's just flipped totally from what it used to be to what it is now.
And as I understand it, all of the projects that have been built, or all the projects that have been rehabbed for residential use, have been successful projects. And there are many, many more under construction today. But that's brought new life into the downtown area. Not just daytime life, but 24-hour life into Nashville, Tennessee.